This is George Galloway for كلمة on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting كلمة where every word is free. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, where we have assembled an audience of distinguished experts and one or two gifted amateurs like me to discuss the anti-Muslim backlash to the wave of terror attacks across the world. Although, to be honest, that's a slight misnomer, because there has been a rising tide of Islamophobic attacks on the Muslim community, on their property, their schools, their mosques and other institutions for quite a long time now. Maybe even before the 9/11 events of 2001, and certainly on an escalating curve thereafter. And with the invasion and destruction, occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001, 2, 3, and beyond, that curve has steadily increased. Now, in the wake of the events in Paris, where well over 100 people were cruelly murdered in a terrorist atrocity, and many hundreds more were wounded, and many thousands more were traumatized from their proximity to those attacks. The fear amongst the general population of terrorism has grown exponentially, even in the United States. Since 1980, 1.15 million people in the United States have been shot to death. Now, more than 99% of their assailants, of their murderers, were not Muslims. That goes without saying. But the fear in the United States of a terrorist attack has fueled the entire presidential election campaign, not just of Donald Trump, who's breaking new records in Islamophobia, but making the Islamophobia of all the other candidates seem kind of reasonable. It's not the Muslims that are carrying out these terrorist attacks. It's people who claim to be Muslims, that's true, but whose main target is Muslims. They've killed far more Muslims than anybody else. In fact, they're killing hundreds of Muslims virtually every day. And not just in Iraq and Syria, which we've grown used to, but in Libya, that country that was liberated by NATO, the United States, France and Britain not so long ago, in Nigeria and in many other places. But the backlash is underway against all the Muslims. And there are many reasons for standing up against that. First of all, it's immoral and wrong. But secondly, it's very foolish, because all that it's going to do is recruit more terrorists for the people who caused the scare in the first place. What do I mean? Well, if you pump the air full of Islamophobia, if every front page and every news bulletin is Muslim this, Muslim that, then if you are a Muslim living in the countries where that's happening, your sense of alienation, marginalization, fear for yourself and for your family is going to itself grow exponentially. If in these countries new, more and more anti-Muslim laws are being introduced, regulations and practices, if every Muslim with a rucksack is stopped by a teacher and asked if they have a bomb in it, if every hijabi wearing girl fears that someone's going to tear it from her head, if every man with a beard, even a Sikh wearing a turban who's mistakenly taken for a Muslim, is in fear of his life on public transport, as has been happening repeatedly in London over these last few weeks, then you're deepening the swamp of hatred, bitterness, alienation, marginalization from which these terrorists climbed in the first place. So I stand against this anti-Muslim backlash, both because it is completely unjustified and immoral, but also because it will achieve the precise opposite of that goal, that aim that its practitioners state as their own. If they want to have fewer recruits to the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their mindset, well, they're going entirely the wrong way about it. But we have now an audience, as I said, of distinguished experts, and none is more distinguished than the first of my guests. He's the head of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee in the United Kingdom, MPAC we still call it. It's the best, in my opinion, of the Muslim community's campaigning organisations, and its head is here. Nana, please.
With regards to Islamophobia in the UK, it's very interesting about what you're saying and about what we're seeing, that you can't just treat it as the odd far-right white supremacist individual that is going around, trying to attack a Muslim woman wearing a niqab. It's an industry, and I think that's vital for people to understand, that it's not the odd individual. It's a well-funded, well-organized machine that activates, especially when it's like a crisis like the Paris attacks or Woolwich or some Charlie Hebdo, any other atrocity that takes place. They activate and mobilize and try to set and propagate a narrative that says, these Muslims, they're barbaric, they're uncivilized, they'll never be like us. And what it does is that drip effect of constantly saying Muslims are the other, Muslims are different from us, has led to, as we've seen, the spike in attacks on Muslims. So just in the UK alone, we had a 300% increase in attacks on Muslims on UK soil. Now, and that isn't just by chance. It's because people are saying, look at these Muslims once again. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. That's that kind of rhetoric that's been going around for decades now. Well, it's finally, guess what, we're seeing the end result, which is Muslims being attacked on our streets. But what's more worrying is that the general public, because they've had to see this for so many years, it's dehumanized Muslims to a point that actually very few are outraged. I mean, it's become almost kind of regular stories. Oh, here's another Muslim being attacked. There's this happening. There's this legislation. And the thing is you can't separate Islamophobia from the wider issue. Islamophobia in the UK is not separate from the war on terror. It's all linked. So let me explain. For you to be able to justify drone strikes that kills a family going to a wedding in South Waziristan, for you to be able to justify Guantanamo Bay, for you to be able to justify any wars, illegal wars, you have to dehumanize the other side. And Islamophobia plays a vital role in that, because it strips Muslims of their basic human ability, their dignity. And what it says, that they will never be like us, they'll always be a threat to us. And really, we've seen that in Europe and in America. It's been an ongoing issue that Muslims are the other. And sadly, the end result is what we're seeing now.
Well, that's as powerfully expressed as I've heard. So you are at the sharp end. What kind of things are happening to Muslims in Britain today?
Yeah, well, it's very important to break it down into different elements. So one you've got is the far-right groups. That's what people see most of. You've got the demonstrations, you've got the ban this mosque, ban the burqa, etc. So that has grown. And even with that, it's very fascinating to watch the growth of it. So, for example, we know the names of the English Defence League. We know of Britain's First. But there was another organisation that sprung up. It was earlier this year in Derby, where they were looking to build one of the mega mosques, that they were calling it. And this organisation called Football Fans Against the Islamization of Europe came about. And basically it was a splinter group of the EDL. And what that showed was that these groups are actually splintering off from each other because they feel the other one's not extreme enough. That's what's happening. So that's.
And then there's the German origin Pegida.
Yes, and we're going to see a relaunch of that in the UK, which Tommy Robinson, who was supposedly de-radicalized by the Quilliam Foundation, is now heading up, and he's bringing it to Birmingham, which has one of the largest Muslim communities there, again, just to seed the sows of division and hatred. And so that's one element, but then you also got legislation.
Well, before you leave that element, we ought to, for an international audience, make clear that if you put all of these organizations together, if you piled them on top of each other, it wouldn't be much of a hill. This is not Germany even, where Pegida had, for a time at least, audiences of 50,000 and more in Leipzig and elsewhere. In Britain, these extreme right organizations can't rally more than a couple of hundreds at any of their events. Maybe a few hundred would be a better way to express that. So pernicious and vicious and nasty as they are, they themselves are of course a threat to individual Muslims who cross their path, but they don't constitute an existential threat to the lives of Muslims in Britain. Am I right about that?
Oh no, definitely. You're right about that. That they represent a small element of the problem, but it's something that's highlighted the most, just because they're so openly vile in what they say. So, for example, Donald Trump is another great example of that. It's you see what he says more than everyone else, and you know, you have people like the Fox News and others, you know, are saying that they're shocked at the comments made by Donald Trump.
Shocked, absolutely shocked.
Exactly. You know, they're disgusted by how could Donald Trump say such things when they've been readying the ground for that. You know, what's more worrying than Donald Trump's comments were the cheering and the whooping in the background.
And a Muslim is the co-owner of Fox News, I just remind you.
No, God, that's I think one thing Muslims should apologise for. That, but it's you know, the far right. You're right that they themselves represent a small, you know, part of the problem. But I think for Muslims and wider society, what we have to look at is that it's an industry. You know, just one example I'll give you is an individual called Pamela Geller in America, who many people have heard of, and it's her full-time job to demonize and attack Muslims, not just in America,
with a big budget too.
With a massive budget. And that's the point I want to make about her, is that she earns in a year $200,000 in a year, putting in the top 5% of earners in America. So what they've said is, don't worry about money, you focus on one job, and that is making Islam dehumanize the Muslims in America and around the world. And guess what? She's doing a great job in that. But it's the thing, it's an industry, there is money being plowed into it to say that legitimize our illegal wars, you know, legitimize what we're doing around the Muslim world, legitimize Guantanamo by dehumanizing the Muslims. So you're right, and it's growing. And I think that's what's worrying for Muslims, and we're seeing a lot of it with people coming to us.
When we see videos of out of thin air, vicious attacks on Muslim women with pushchairs, or elderly Muslim men being attacked on buses, being forced off buses because of what they look like, and the kind of hate that is thrown at Muslims in the street, that's not coming from organized far-right groups. Of course, the atmosphere is influenced by those far-right groups and by Fox News and other media outlets, but it's coming from members of the public. And shockingly, for many, surprising and shocking for me, some of it is coming from people who are themselves from minority ethnic communities. So that we've had, for example, recent instances of black British people, themselves the victims of racism and marginalization, turning on a Muslim lady on the bus. How do you account for that?
Oh no, it's been horrific to see. But the thing is, again, it's been building for a while now. You know, we've had Sikh groups who say they support the EDL against the Muslims. You've had other individuals who've said they joined the BNP and other organizations. So it's being fed. It's this thing that says turn one minority on the other, and it's a game that's been played for decades and centuries. The kind of divide and rule, divide and conquer, and time again we've seen it played, and it's being played out here too, where what they're saying is Muslims are a threat to our way of life. But what some people don't realize is that our way of life doesn't really include many of the minorities. It excludes them too. And really, that's why you see people like MPAC, Islamic Human Rights Commission, and other organizations and individuals, Muslim and non-Muslim, campaigning, because they're saying that this takes us down a road as a society where we are turning against each other and saying that they're not human, they're not, you know, they don't deserve rights, they don't deserve the same rights. And so yeah, but not only do you see people turning on each other with Islamophobic attacks like we saw on the London buses in the UK, but more so what you see is a silence, a deafening silence, that when there is legislation passed through that explicitly targets Muslim children, you see other community, other ethnic minority communities, other minority groups not really speaking out. But what they don't realize is it's momentum building, taking us down a road where actually it affects us all.
Now we have IHRC with us, I think. Who's representing them? Please tell us the extent to which you agree with that and any disagreements that you have.
Okay. I just want to unpack some of the stuff that Raza has mentioned. That he mentioned this otherization. The Islamic Human Rights Commission has been conducting the only kind of academic research in the field of Islamophobia, and it goes back well over a decade. Now, a lot of people are thinking about Islamophobia as a recent phenomenon. This is something that's come up all of a sudden, and maybe due to the rise of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, whatever it may be. But what we argue is that there's institutional racism that's always existed and has continued to exist, just comes around and manifests in different forms. So, for example, our reports, date back from the early 90s, well before 2001, before 9/11 happened, and we've seen there has been Islamophobic attacks on Muslims here in the UK. Yes, what we've seen is the rise of Islamophobic attacks in cities where you have largely non-white communities, where people of colour turning against other people of colour. And the individual who attacked this disabled guy on a bus, his name was Kashif Samuels. Many people have said that he's of a Muslim background as well. And what we are saying is that
he threw the old man's wheelchair.
That's right. Yes, he actually threw it off the bus
and assaulted the old man.
And what we are saying is that the institutions have created this environment of hate. This environment allows people, individuals, organizations, the media to be able to say what they want to say and get away with it. Now, what's happened is that we have supposedly overcome racism. Now, everyone who wants to become Islamophobic have now institutionalized racism and said, look, we're not racist, but we have issues with Islam or Islamism or non-violent extremists. Now, what's happening in the process is that as time goes by, this hatred against Islam or hatred against people of other faiths and colors has almost mutated to the point that mainstream politicians, such as the likes of Donald Trump, who's actually a candidate for the presidency in America,
the leading candidate
as well, and is able to say what he wants to say and get away with it. And the environment of hate has led to these violence, the attacks. And if you have seen that every sector of society, that Muslims are accused of not integrating or assimilating. But the reality is, there was a report launched in response to the census by the Muslim Council of Britain. And they said that categorically that Muslims are trying to integrate, and actually Muslims are moving out of areas where there's high levels of Muslim population into white areas. But what they term as the white flight is that you see as Muslims move into an area, white people are moving out, and the prices are dropping, and so therefore you have this ghettoized community unintentionally caused by some Muslims moving out. And what we've done in recent times, not only have we looked at the UK community, but we've actually taken this academic report to other countries. So, for example, we've started off about 4 years ago in the UK as a pilot project, and then we've moved into France. We did the same report in Canada and Australia. And shockingly, the figures are showing that as time goes by, these Western industrialized, modernized, democratic nations are so institutional racist, is the fact that it's just manifesting it in different forms, and we're fooled by the fact that people have moved beyond the era of racism.
Well, you say they've moved. They certainly claim they've moved. I myself don't agree with that. When I hear people say, I'm not racist, Islam is not a race, Muslims are not a race, they are a religion. Well, of course that's true. Islam is a religion for everywhere and everybody, but in Britain, the vast majority of Muslims, 99%, I would say, are people of colour, which is one of the reasons why Sikhs get attacked, because they're mistaken for Muslims. So, from my point of view, there's a bit of displacement activity going on. People who, if Islam didn't exist, God forbid, would hate people of colour for another reason, because of the food they eat, or the music they like, or what they smoke in their pipes, or whatever they could fasten upon, they would express their hatred that way. There's another aspect I'd like your comment on, probably after the break now, and it's this. I come from a white working class background. Much of the hatred of Muslims comes from that segment of society, which is a problem because that's a very, very big segment of society. White working class people are themselves now heavily disadvantaged. They have been abandoned by the political process, and the communities they once had have been atomized and destroyed. If I give you one example, a place called Dagenham in the far east of London. Once upon a time it had a Ford motor factory where everybody worked. They were all in a trade union. They all got paid good wages. They had council houses. They had a council swimming pool and a community centre and an ice rink and all the things that a community has. Now they don't have any of that. Council houses are gone, Ford's gone, the unions have gone, the wages have gone, the council housing is gone. And so you have a mass of people who are put upon, angry, and looking for somebody to blame. And if there were no Muslims in Britain, trust me, they would blame the black guy on the corner from Jamaica. Islam is just a convenient lightning rod for this anger and this hatred. And so I lay, and you're right to point out, I did also in my introduction, this long predates Paris, long predates the Iraq War, long predates 9/11. But it has accelerated as a result of all of these things. We'll come back to that in the next part. You're watching Kalimahoora with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing the anti-Muslim backlash, the wave of Islamophobia which is sweeping Britain, the United States, France, and many other Western countries. I was going to say in the wake of the attacks on Paris, except it started long before that. I was going to say in the wake of 9/11, but it also started way before that. But there is no doubt that its pace is quickening, its effects more deadly. We took the Kalimahoora camera onto the streets of London earlier to ask the people what they thought. Take a look at this.
Do you think that there is an anti-Islam feeling in this country after the Paris attack?
I think it has been growing. I think there has been one originally since, 9/11, etc. Muslims have always been kind of a culture or a religion that's always had a sort of doubt around it. But I think definitely after the Paris attacks, it's escalated to another level.
I'm not sure actually, but I think there is, especially like just around where I live as well. I live like in an area where there is a lot of Muslim people and there's a lot of like diverse culture all around, and I feel like most people are a bit scared.
Yes, I think a lot of the sort of stories that you see in the news nowadays about sort of horrible bigoted attacks on Muslims because people can't differentiate between ISIS and Islam are becoming more and more prevalent, and I think a lot of the sort of right-wing press in the Daily Mail, you see people specifically targeted or specifically discriminated against because of their religion.
I haven't seen any myself.
That the UK government should be extra careful with Muslims or maybe treat them differently?
Not differently, because everyone's a citizen within the country, but just to be wary of what people are doing to them, just to give them more security and take their point of view, because everyone is a citizen here and not everyone's involved in the attack, so they should be treated as normal people within the country.
I don't think we have to treat Muslims differently because purely they are Muslims. I think that in itself is not the right tack to take, but I think that certainly sort of previous military interventions, a lot of the way that Muslims are sort of seen in popular culture is quite negative through things like the Daily Mail. I think that's surely something we have to focus on instead of treating them differently.
Well, there you go. That's the point of view in Bloomsbury, which, for those who don't know London, is very civilized and sophisticated part of town. The environs of SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, a well-educated group of people. I must say to you, if you'd taken the camera to Dagenham, that I mentioned before, the response would have been different. What did you think of what I had to say before the break?
And you touched upon the points of poverty and the people, the working class people are struggling. Now, Martin Luther King, just before he was assassinated, said that there's three evils of society: poverty, racism, and war. And those three feed into each other. And what's happened is that we've been fighting wars since 2001. Let's just say that racism and Islamophobia started from that point on. But since then, we've been fighting wars that we can't afford. And we've been, when David Cameron came into power this term around, he said there's going to be 12 billion cuts in the welfare state. So what's going to happen is that you're kind of redirecting funds that are people in this country that desperately need, the NHS needs, the education needs, the housing sector needs, is being redirected to fight wars in countries where not only are you going to destroy lives, but you're going to create more terrorists in the process. So we have people who are working class people who are struggling, who are finding it very difficult to live, living in one of the most unequal societies in the world today, in the UK, are trying to find an outlet, to find a reason to blame someone, to say, why are we in this condition? Oh, so we see this rise of refugees and asylum seekers coming. We see this rise of non-white faces in the UK. And we must have people rise up to these challenges. Now, the mainstream politics doesn't talk about or doesn't relate to these working class people. So then you have the rise of kind of the BNP that kind of mutates to EDL and the Britain First and Pegida. Now, there was an interview recently by I believe there's a leader of Pegida in the UK, and he was asked, so what is your issue with Islam? He goes, well, the only thing that he had to say in some sort of articulate fashion was the grooming of white girls. But statistically, if you look at the grooming issue, there's far more Asian girls that are being groomed to take part in the sex trade, to take part in the drugs business, than the white girls. But
well, look, the vast majority of people committing sexual offences against young people, girls and boys, are not Muslim. But if you just read the popular newspapers, you would think that that was the opposite of the truth. Let's be honest, though. There are dirty, disgusting beasts who have committed horrific sexual offences against children who were Muslim, who were Asian. And of course, every Muslim then is not just a terrorist, but a potential groomer of children for disgusting sexual practices. I want this program to be introspective to some extent, and I'll return to another aspect of that. But let me more fully explain what I meant at the end of the first half. You see, Muslims have a community. They have extended families, and they respect their extended families. The grandmother, the grandfather, the parents, the children, the auntie, the uncle, they're all together amongst Muslims. And they tend, for a variety of mainly economic reasons, to live in the same area. So there's a tremendous amount of interplay between members of the extended family amongst Muslims. Muslims come together for the mosque, even if it's only on Jummah. They have buildings that they can all go to and all do go to. They have, through their own efforts largely, community facilities that they've built up with their own hands and their own money, with less and less help from the state. The poorest whites don't have any of that. It's quite likely that there will be single-parent households with the father gone. It's very unlikely that they'll live in the same area as the grandparents, the aunties, the uncles. They don't go to the church. They probably never did, but there's nowhere else now for them to go. They can't go to the community center. They can't go to the swimming pool. They don't live the life that they used to live in the 1950s and 60s. So poor whites are atomized in society as just individuals hurtling around without any direction, without any sense of community. And they are not to be blamed for that. Actually, the political class which allowed that, didn't allow it, created the destruction of working class communities, must take the blame for that. Now, let's take another contribution. Who'd like to speak next?
My name is Lamia, and I'm a student at SOAS. So I think a lot of something that I have a big problem with is the fact that ever since 9/11, like, Muslims keep, like, we have this problem where we have to keep justifying and apologizing for all, like, for less than 1% of these people that proclaim to be our faith. And what we do is we keep abusing ourselves mentally, saying, like, Muslims are not terrorists, Muslims aren't terrorists. And we've been saying this for, like, over 14 years at this point. And I feel like it's just so bad for us to do that to ourselves, because we're just so much more than not terrorists. We're lawyers and doctors and students and contributors of society. And I feel like the more you correlate Muslim and terrorist in the same sentence, even though you're negating it, you're psychologically just enforcing the correlation with each other. So every time there's a terrorist attack, people think, oh, was it the Muslims? Even though it could have been some white, crazy white individual in the US shooting up a school. Like, the first thing people think is, oh, like, someone shot up a school, was it a Muslim? So I just, yeah.
Well, no disrespect to the two previous speakers, but that was an extremely important contribution, and coming from an American Muslim, perhaps more so, because we do need to look at this not just through the prism of British events and British eyes, because this is a phenomenon that is occurring in the United States, big time in the Trump campaign. Tell me, as an American, as an educated American, how do you view the possibility of President Trump?
Wow. I hope that's not a possibility.
It's a definite possibility.
I would much rather just move away, but I mean, I probably would have to anyway.
You wouldn't get back in.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Who'd want back in if he was the president?
I feel like I'd like to be a little bit more hopeful with the Trump case, in the sense that, yeah, he's gaining some popularity, but one thing that needs to be taken into account is that it's still a very small percentage of the American population, because he's a Republican, which approximately, let's say, is half the country. But even then, there are about like 5 or 6 other Republican candidates with their own constituencies. So he might be the most popular among the Republican side, but he's still not representing all of them. So I'd like to be a bit...
but just for those that don't follow these things, only 50% of the Americans will vote in the presidential election. So you only need to get effectively 25.1% of the Americans to vote for you if you're going to, if I got the maths right there, if you're going to triumph. And as of today's recording, Donald Trump is on 41%, and his nearest rival, Cruz, who's a pretty vicious guy himself, is on 10%. And Ben Carson, who's equally vicious, is on 9%. And Jeb Bush, whoever imagined we'd be praying for a Bush to get stronger and to somehow come through, on the basis that he's the only one of them that you could probably count on not to trip up on his way to the bathroom in the night and press the nuclear button and plunge us into world war. He's on 3%. Trump is on 41%. I take your point that he's only running amongst the Republicans, but he's turning out to have quite a bit of crossover appeal. And I'm wondering if you think it's partly for the same reasons as my Dagenham thesis, that there's so much unhappiness in the United States that suddenly Muslims have emerged, even though Muslims are the tiniest fraction of America's population. Muslims have emerged as a convenient scapegoat, as a convenient whipping boy.
I absolutely think that's one of many reasons. Another thing is Muslim communities happen to, for the most part in the U.S., be a bit more on the upper socioeconomic side, or they tend to do better academically. Parents
Unlike here, actually, most Muslims in Britain are poor. Most Muslims in America are not poor.
Yeah, so I feel like it comes off as very threatening to the majority white community there, or all these quote-unquote model minorities, or even East Asians. I just feel like they come off as threatening the overall hegemonic presence that's already there, and I feel like what Trump does just helps gather marginalized white working class communities also into targeting and hating the other group. I do agree with you on that.
So I just want to come back on some of the points about that. It's very interesting because you said you want to be this a show about introspection. And one thing definitely that I'd say about for Muslims in the UK that we failed on is that it's, like you're saying, it's, because I live near Dagenham, I actually live near Barking, so I know what you're talking about. I've seen the fact that you have atomized, white working class community, individuals now who are, and you're right, they are being fed a narrative that says it's because of the Muslims, they're doing this, everything would be great and rosy in England if it wasn't for those damn Muslims. So they are being fed that narrative, but I think that's where Muslim institutions fail spectacularly. And actually, so for example, after Paris attacks, really what should have happened is we should have had every single mosque in this country opening their doors to the general wider public and saying, come and talk to us, find out about Islam, let's get involved. So you're right, although the Muslim community itself is a bit fractured in different places, you've got the sectarian issues as well, it's a bit more organized as a community overall than compared to the white working class community. But really the mosque should be a hub for the society, for Muslims and non-Muslims, and in many cases I feel many mosques in this country have failed to provide an avenue to let people into. So for example, when Jack Straw, former foreign secretary of this country, said that the niqab that women wear makes them uncomfortable, what should have happened is every mosque said, come and have a chat with us about your concerns, tell us what's going on. The grooming gang issue, again, it's an opportunity. Yes, it's a threat in that it's dehumanizing Muslims, but it's an opportunity to actually talk to people on the ground, something that a newspaper can't do. All it can do is publish a headline, but you can fill in the gaps, you can actually talk to people. And that's where I feel that the Muslim institutions haven't really played their part. So as I agree, there's an Islamophobia industry that is well funded, well organized, that has been dehumanizing Muslims, but Muslim institutions haven't really helped our community either, because A, they don't open their doors, but B, the young Muslim that comes in looking for answers, to be honest, all they walk away with normally is a sermon in Arabic they don't understand, or they'll get a talk on a topic that isn't relevant to what they're facing in their environment, the current affairs based thing. So really it turns off young people. So our mosques, and rather than being an active community hub, they've become glorified gentlemen's clubs, and it has played its part in fueling Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred.
I'll take you right after this. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen television, coming to you from London. And earlier we took the كلمة cameras out onto the streets to ask people what they thought about the rising tide of Islamophobic hatred. Take a look at this.
What's your view on the war crime that is being committed against Muslims?
The war crimes, I feel like it's truly horrendous.
Is that a mental health issue, or is that an issue of racism or anti-Muslim bigotry, which I prefer the term to Islamophobia, because I think you should be able to attack Islam as a idea.
I think it's actually really scary as a Muslim being brought up here and just knowing that boroughs that are so near you are facing these issues. So it actually makes you feel really insecure leaving your house in the morning, that you don't know what your day ahead's going to lie.
I haven't heard much, but I think there was one in Romford. There was like a bombing thing, and I don't think it was right to that thing happen.
Do you think that ISIS is benefiting from Muslims being discriminated in Western society?
I do think that, because I think that what ISIS really want to do, what one of their central sort of goals is to sort of in Western society form a barrier between Muslims and between sort of white, sort of in Britain, Anglo-Saxon communities. I think that by doing that they can sort of fuel this alienation and then sort of bring people towards jihad.
I guess they're getting recognition, like their name is being known, being talked about, so I guess that's kind of like what they're benefiting from, but I don't think in the long run they would.
Well, the contribution struck me in that segment was the young woman who said that she feels very insecure, that she is frightened to go out in the morning. She doesn't know what her day is going to hold. And that's a very, very powerful problem. So let's go to the back of the room, take the young man. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Abbas Ali. I'm a university undergraduate, and my contribution is more in the form of a question, which is open to everyone, but only at that. It is, what do you think the British government has done well in combating Islamophobia? For example, I think the police have now labelled Islamophobia as a hate crime now, or a conviction if you're going through the courts. But yeah, that's my question. What do you think the government has done well in tackling Islamophobia? Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I think they haven't done anything well. I think that everything that they have done has compounded the problems that would have been there in any case. Governments are not responsible for people's racism. That's intrinsic to all human society. It's true in countries where the majority are black. There's racism against other groups in their own society, even on the shade of blackness that people are. There's racism amongst Arabs, about Asians. There's racism amongst white Protestants against white Catholics, like the community from which I spring. There's racism and bigotry is in the human condition. It's the work of shaitan if you are a believer. But everything that the government has done has made all of these pre-existing problems worse. We have invaded and occupied Muslim country after country after country. In order to justify it, we have demonized and terrified our own population about this or that Muslim leader. And we said, I was one of the leaders of the anti-war movement in 2003, and we said, if you make war against Muslims abroad, you'll end up at war with Muslims at home, because you're not going to accomplish the trick of saying that Johnny Muslim over there is so bad we have to move heaven and earth to destroy him. But the Muslim who runs your corner shop or has the Indian restaurant at the end of the road or who sells you a newspaper, he's fine. He's a nice fellow. He's a different kind of Muslim. And they haven't pulled that trick off. And so the more we have been at war with and demonizing Muslims abroad, the more problems we've had at home. And moreover, we have had specific initiatives of the British government which have been spectacular failures at best and counterproductive at worst. I, for example, challenged Jack Straw when he said that he would no longer meet his own constituents if they were wearing a niqab because it made him uncomfortable. He needed to see her lips moving. I made the point there's not much future for radio then, because with radio you never see anybody's lips moving. And I made the point that these women were his constituents and he had an obligation to deal with them and no right whatsoever to interfere with the way that they dressed. And moreover, that a tiny, tiny fragment of Muslim women in Britain wore niqabs. But this became, niqab, burqa, became the issue of the day for many, many months. It's been superseded now by more serious matters. And they poured millions of pounds into a program called Prevent, which didn't just not prevent, it motivated and helped extremism in the country to grow. They thought that if you give £1 million, £2 million, £3 million to some stooge Muslim who will parrot the government's line, that would make less extremism. Actually, it makes more extremism, because people hate those that claim to be speaking on their behalf with the government's £1 million tucked into their back pocket. But here I'm going to say something controversial, at least I think it might be. There is a problem of extremism amongst the Muslims in Britain and around the world. That extremism hurts and harms Muslims and Islam even more than it harms anybody else. There are fanatics, there are extremists, there are sectarians, there are people who hate not just other religions, in defiance of Islam, by the way, which requires a Muslim to honor other peoples of the book, but doesn't just hate other religions, but hates their people in their own religion who don't subscribe to a very, very narrow interpretation of Islam that they believe in. Anybody who's ever gone up the Edgware Road in the summertime and seen the kind of behavior that is clearly visible there, the vice and the corruption that it is possible to visit there. I mean, my own mother asked me, I don't know how you could go around with the Muslims when I see some of the behavior of some Muslims. These are all uncomfortable truths. I see some of you shifting in your seats, but they are truths, in my opinion. And then there's a much milder end of the scale. The point that was made by MPAC. The Muslim community in Britain, 2 million strong, is very poorly led. It's led by people who have more than half an eye on the House of Lords and their own elevation, or it's led by people who might have been suitable leaders back in Mirpur in Pakistan in the 70s, but they're not suitable for leadership in Britain in 2015. And young Muslims, like the people that we've got here, they need to be the leaders because they come from here, they can speak the language properly, they understand public relations, they understand that the way when a bad thing happens, it's bad, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to open doors, to clear the air, to convince people that Islam is not bad, it's good. That the Muslims, when they're behaving like Muslims, are the best citizens, the model neighbor. But how often is that done? Very, very infrequently indeed.
Ahmed Amin, Islamic Human Rights Commission. The topic of refugees and asylum seekers came up as we are opening our doors. But as Aaron Kundani, the academic, says that we are here because you are over there. And since 1492, when it's the inception of colonialism, we've seen European nations go and butcher and massacre and pillage countries from all over the world, and doing this to this very day. And if you look at the French economy, a lot of the economy is actually supported by very poor African nations. In some ex-colonial countries, I call it ex-colonial, but some of the African nations from the French colonies, they're given 80% of their wealth to the French economy because they were liberated, because they were given independence. And so the fact is that and as I mentioned, 1492, when Muslims lost power in Grenada, Muslims were made to look silly in everything, and they were faults were picked up on everything. So the fact that Muslims had a shower every Friday or had a shower every day was picked on. They were, people picked on the fact that Muslims wore certain clothes, or the way it danced in a certain way, or listened to certain music, certain type of music. So once there is this environment of hate, this otherization that's created, whatever you do, there will be a problem with it. And as I mentioned, the fact that the mosques aren't doing enough and the community is not doing enough. no doubt that we're not doing enough. But the reality is that the Muslims are the most charitable group of people here in the UK, according to Just Giving. We are far more generous than any other religious community here in the UK. And not just to Muslim charities, but to charities across the board, from Amnesty International to British Heart Foundation to Islamic Relief to anything you mentioned. We are far more generous. But the fact that is, no matter what we do, it will never be good enough to be able to kind of eradicate this racism. And the reason why, and as you mentioned, is that the reason why people are here is because they're still kind of bombing our nations all over the world. And the Syrians are leaving Syria now after years of civil war. And they've had to withstand it. And the reason why here is because they want to save themselves so that they can go back there, not kind of live here in Europe.
Well, one or two of those points are contentious. The vast majority of them I agree with. But the main problem is we have to acknowledge the existence of terrorists in our midst. Otherwise, no one will take us seriously. It's true that the Muslims are the most generous community. It's also true that there's guys going around with beheading movies in on their telephones and buying 12-inch kitchen knives and planning to cut people's heads off. That's also true. And if we don't acknowledge it, no one will take us seriously. The question is, what are we doing about the extremism in the Ummah? Not enough, I say. Not enough. And in fact, some people excuse it by reference to colonialism, reference to the Iraq war and occupation and so on. There isn't a bigger opponent of colonialism in the country than me. There isn't a bigger opponent of the wars that we're engaged in the Muslim world than me. But there are people in the Muslim community who have a sickness, a sectarian, violent, extremist sickness. And if we don't say that and develop a strategy to confront it, no one will take us seriously. Now, a fellow at Leytonstone underground station a couple of Saturdays ago cut an old man's throat and said, this is for Syria. Now, it may turn out, because the case has not been judged, that he did so out of mental illness. And indeed, his family had presented him to the police weeks before to say that he was expressing drug-induced signs of psychosis. It may turn out that it was not for Syria. It may turn out that it was for an entirely different set of mental health reasons. But the point is, the people in Leytonstone are now afraid of anybody that looks like a Muslim in the underground station on a Saturday night. And we have to identify with those who feel that fear. We have to say, we're scared too. He might have cut our throat. We have to say, as the guy said right after that instant, to the man as he lay being shackled by the police, you ain't no Muslim, bruv. No Muslim does things like you do. Now, I think I need to say, we'll be back right after this. You're watching Kalima on Al-Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway, in London. We're discussing the anti-Muslim backlash of hatred and bigotry, which is sweeping Western countries, including our own. We have an audience of distinguished experts and one or two gifted amateurs like me. Let's hear, please.
I just wanted to come back to something that Ahmed mentioned earlier, and you were touching upon as well, that actually dealing with these issues. One thing that I found that we're really poor at in the UK is, you'll see an attack. You'll see someone say, I am a Muslim and I have committed this attack. So ISIS, they say they're Muslims and they commit these attacks. And the worst thing that happens is that you'll get some random mosque leader who'll say, Islam is peace. And what happens is that jars with the wider society, because it's saying, hang on, you're saying Islam is peace, and that guy has just said he's Muslim and he's beheaded someone. It doesn't add up. It's like someone saying you're fat, ugly and stupid, and you say I'm not fat. Well, you're still ugly and stupid. You've not dealt with their issues. And I think that's where we're very poor as actually the messaging battle, because the Islamophobia industry is, take away the evilness, they're very effective at how they get their message out. The message says it is a Muslim problem. You know, it's at any point, any Muslim can become radicalized, they read the Quran in a literal manner, etc. And what's happened is that you're right, it's far too long we have been reactionary. But if you look at after the Paris attacks, what worried me, George, was that really within the UK you had very few Muslim organizations, institutions actually coming out publicly tackling the anti-Muslim narrative. What happened was some of them said, it's not within my remit. I'm a Dawah organization, I'm an advocacy organization, I'm this organization. And what happened was they allowed, in that vacuum, the Islamophobes to basically dictate the way we go forward as a society. And off the back of that, we had the UK voting to bomb Syria. And it's because we were not trying to deal with this message that said, it's Muslims, we must do this, we must do that. You know, I think that's where we really fail, that we've actually, especially in the world of social media, where it actually allows you to reach millions. You don't have to go through.
You don't even have to get cold or wet.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
don't have to go out in the rain.
Exactly,
You can
yeah.
do it in your own living room.
So it's easier for us to actually reach the general public, because remember, it's about influencing policy and influencing and public opinion, making them understand the problem. And I think that's where, as Muslims, we do fail on that. And it's actually, we can do a better job. And I think part of it is that we need younger Muslims to be given that platform. But if we're not given that platform, create our own. And I think social media allows us to take lead on that. And we have to, because otherwise the Islamophobes have no barrier.
Madam.
I'd just like to add, as a young Muslim, it's also increasingly difficult to be growing up in a Western society when your immigrant parents constantly tell you, oh, we just want you to get a job, like, stay safe, don't talk about your political opinions too much, don't express yourself too much, don't get on anyone's radars. And I feel like it's very difficult to be a young Muslim growing up battling between two different cultures, a more traditional one at home where you're told to suppress yourself, or being in a Western society that's also kind of, you know, attacking you in very different ways, or like suppressing your American or British or whatever identity that you identify with. So it's very hard for young Muslims like myself to be able to express ourselves without feeling marginalized or not knowing what to say or how to say it, because at the end of the day it's like, do I work to get a job and just, you know, go the safe route, or do I try and speak my mind but potentially marginalize myself further? So I feel like that's also...
the latter course, let's call it the timid and frightened course, will not protect you in any way. The man who pushed the Muslim woman in front of an underground train, the man who attacked a Muslim woman from behind and threw her to the ground, the women who attacked the other mother with a young baby in a pushchair because she was wearing a hijab on the bus. None of these people knew anything about the politics or profile of the people that they were attacking. So even if you never say another word, never appear on Kaliма again, even if you never express a single political view, you'll still be an other. This otherization that Ahmed was talking about. Otherization is not based on your political views, but what you've got on your head, and the color of your skin, and the way that you pray, and where that you came from. This timid, I won't call it cowardly, I don't want to insult your parents, but the timid, frightened approach,
I agree,
is doomed to failure.
But I feel like this is also part of the whole institutional racism, because now you have officials telling parents, oh, if your child is expressing some anti-government sentiments, or if they're doing XYZ, which is really ridiculous in my opinion, then they may be an extremist.
On the path to radicalization. We had a council in London, Camden Council, issue guidelines to teachers just the other week, which said if the child begins to question official versions of the news, they may be on the path to radicalization. Of course, that means well over half the population in Britain are currently radical. No, what we must do, surely, is to, first of all, be brave. There is no one to fear but God. In fact, on the last day, that's the only person that you have to persuade of what you've done in your life. And so cowardice and dishonesty will not get you very far in the next life, but doesn't get you very far in this one either. So we have to be brave. We have to be clear. We have to be clear about what Islam is and what it isn't. Because if we don't, we're only feeding and strengthening those who hate Islam. That's why I'm returning to this issue of sectarianism. Whenever I say anything about Syria, about Iran, about Al-Mayadeen, about Press TV, there are people, voices, and not a few of them, who say, you're a Shiite. I say, I'm not a Shiite. I'm saying what I'm saying because I believe it. Now, why don't you argue about what I believe rather than trying to weaken the power of what I'm saying by hanging labels on it? Now, all the Muslims have to stop this foolish idiocy of allowing themselves to be divided on sectarian lines by people who have no idea what a Shiite is. The British and American governments would run out of words in 60 seconds if I asked them to define the difference between Sunni and Shia. They don't care whether you're a Sunni or a Shia. They only care about whether you're going to be a slave to them or not. That's what they care about. You could be a Shia slave, you could be a Sunni slave, you'll be equally welcome by them. Equally. The point is that you should be a slave. When is somebody going to wake up? When am I going to hear this echo on social media? I was the organizer of the demonstrations against the British bombing of Syria. There were almost no Muslims there. I know the difference. I was outside the Israeli embassy just a few weeks before. There were thousands of Muslims there. In the demonstration outside Parliament against Britain bombing Syria, there were almost no Muslims there. What's the explanation for that? There can only be a sectarian explanation for that, in my opinion. So that tells me we've got a problem. And arguably a bigger problem than the EDL, the BNP, Pegida, and all the ragbag of right-wing extremists. I've spoken too much. Let's take Ahmed, will you sum up your view?
We're talking about Islamophobia today, and the reality is that if we don't get together as a whole nation to stop Islamophobia, what's going to happen is that today it's Muslims, tomorrow it's going to be the Jewish community, and the day after it's going to be anyone else that looks different from the white population. And that's what happens. And we have already seen the trend, that we've seen Sikhs being attacked, we've seen the Jewish community being attacked because of the rise of Islamophobia, because the environment has been created where you can say what you want to do, say what you want to say and do what you want to do and get away with it. And that's my kind of final message, is that we need to combat Islamophobia so we can combat any form of racism here and live as equal citizens.
Thank you very much. Anyone here? Yes, sir.
Assalamu alaikum. My name's Luqman and I'm a psychology student. I just wanted to add that I think one shouldn't underestimate the power that language has in a discourse like this. I think a brother added about the government. I think what can we really say about other people when statements out of Downing Street come out like, you know, Corbyn and co are terrorist sympathisers for purely criticising the killings of innocent children and women. Statements which instantly imply that all the people in Raqqa are terrorists, and everyone in Syria and Iraq that are currently being bombed, innocently or otherwise, are terrorists as well. When you think about that, that's so sinister, it would make even Machiavelli or Shaitan blush, you know. I think what we really need is Muslims like us who could join the discourse. It's going to happen regardless whether we want to or not. And I admire what the brothers here are doing and trying to get to that platform where we can have the debate with David Cameron and co on these issues. But what really frustrates me is how they use the term terrorists loosely to make us feel certain emotions. Like, for example, the 28 children that got killed in a Syrian school. You're not meant to care about that. You're not meant to shed a tear because that's what Orwell called the unpeople. But when 140 or so people get killed in France, you find out about Jane and her husband Joe who got killed, and now she's going to have kids, and you've got this whole massive backstory, and you're meant to feel something. I think it's our job as Muslims to clearly define these terms that are being used loosely and primarily against us in many ways. There is an issue, but I think language plays a powerful role in this discourse and discussion.
A very interesting contribution. Anyone else before we finish?
Thank you. I think the language point is fascinating. You mentioned that because we talk about the anti-Muslim backlash as if it's a response to what's happened. But if you look at what ISIS did, as crazy and horrific and as wrong as it was, we would never call that in our mainstream media a backlash to France's airstrikes. And it's the language has a vital role to play. Even the word Islamist is thrown around in this country, especially, to mean any Muslim that's critical of the government's policy. But going back to what you're saying, where do we go from here? And I think Ahmed put it best. Guess what? They are really bad. Things are getting much worse for Muslims here. We're being dehumanized. We're sidelined. We're isolated. And the government legislation always views our children, our society, through the lens of the war on terror, potential future terrorists. But guess what? That industry that is working day in, day out, the way you counter it is by having our own industry. They're well funded. They're well organized. We need to be well funded. We need to be well organized. They work 24/7 to demonize Islam. We work 24/7 to stop that demonization, to promote Islam. And I think that's where it comes down to, at the end of the day, is work. There must be work done. And some people worry about consequences, they think about those things, but no, we work. And inch by inch we will improve, we'll be able to take on the Islamophobia industry. And that's what we need to see more of. Those Muslims that can join in the good fight, join in. If you can't, at least fund those that work. And it's otherwise we'll always be on the back foot and we'll always be having a show saying, what do we do about Islamophobia? I don't want to be here next year talking about Islamophobia. I want to talk about how we're actually addressing it. But it only comes if we take that step. And I think that's the message to Muslims is take that step. You're on God's side, you can't lose.
The Muslims who've got money don't know what to do about it, and the Muslims who know what to do about it don't have money, which is why your two organizations are so impecunious and yet so vital and important. The Muslim money is in Fox News. The Sun newspaper, the dirtiest, most Islamophobic newspaper in Britain, is part owned by a very prominent Muslim from the Gulf, as is Fox News, equally part owned. I was once asked by a prince, I shan't name him, how come the Israeli lobby is so much more effective than ours? I said, Your Highness, we don't have a lobby. But within 1 mile of where we are sitting, I could show you 500 Muslims throwing millions of pounds on roulette tables and gambling it in casinos that could fund 5 lobbies, 10 lobbies, 500 lobbies. So this is our problem. But we live in an era now, as you rightly identified, you can actually be a lobby for nothing, without any money, just by sitting in your own house and thinking smart and acting smart on social media. And that's why I hope that both of your organizations will be strengthened in this next period. The language point is, of course, crucial. Part of the reason for the growth of this extremism, and we on language should be equally precise. There's nothing wrong with being a fundamentalist, to believe in the fundamentals of your religion. There's nothing wrong with the word jihad, which doesn't mean at all what the Sun says it means. What is wrong is extremism. Extremism, intolerance, hatred for others, even others in your own religion who don't agree with every nuance of yours. And we need to defend ourselves. And the best way to do that is to unite with others who are not Muslims, but who feel the same way as you do about racism, about violence, about war. We achieved that for a time in Britain, in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, when we were all as one. We need to do so again. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra, and thank you to my wonderful audience.